Well, welcome to another How Conversation on Moral Leadership. It's my distinct pleasure to have a conversation with a dear friend and colleague, Dr. Sherry Turkle from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Initiative on Technology and Self. So great to see you, Sherry. Welcome to the How Conversation.
I'm so delighted to be here.
Well, it is a treat for our listeners as well. And I have to say that they are in for a treat to hear from someone who has deep experience, but also incredible empathy herself. You have a PhD in sociology, psychology, and are a licensed clinical psychologist. And your focus is on the subjective side of people's relationship with technology, which is quite interesting and maybe tough at MIT. You are the author of many books. Your most recent, I think, will be the topic of our big part of our discussion today, the Empathy Diaries, a memoir that was just published in the spring of 2021 and is coming out in paperback March of 2022. You also have a couple of bestsellers, Alone Together and Reclaiming Conversation, the Power of Talk in a Digital Age. Let's get going into this How Conversation on Moral Leadership. I can't wait, and I bet our listeners can't either. Are you ready, Sherry Turkle?
I'm ready.
Fantastic. Let me start by asking you a question about what brought you to write the Empathy Diaries. It's a memoir. It's so much of yourself put into this great wisdom for each and every one of us. What made you write it?
Well, for many years, I've been thinking that I had been thinking of calling my book Reclaiming Conversation, an assault on empathy. Because really what something like social media does, what something like Facebook does, what texting, not talking does, is assaulting empathy. Because we're learning to not look at each other, to not be sensitive to the exquisite communications that we get from speaking face to face. We're learning to not pick up signals from each other. And I began to realize that so much of what we consider the most human about ourselves were things that were really being, eroded by technology. And that so much of my work over the years had been a kind of trying to point out to people how important this quality was, and that had been a passion project. And then I thought, passion project, when a researcher has a passion project, that means that there's something in the researcher's background that has made it a passion project. So I decided to go back into my own life and discover what there was in my life that had made empathy a passion project for me. So the book is both, the Empathy Diaries is both my story about why empathy was so important to me personally, and also the story of how I came to study it professionally. And it's sort of an intellectual memoir in that sense.
It's fabulous and so timely of you sharing of yourself for the journey so many of us are on in this pandemic period where,
Yes.
The role of technology has just taken off, but yet, and I like this in your Alone Together, maybe our human connection, and we have a How report on human connection. Share with us a little bit about this massive technological acceleration, but yet maybe this lacking of human connection that we're experiencing.
On the one hand, I'm hopeful because we had what I call a liminal, which means a threshold, a kind of betwixt and between moment, which usually means that you have, because we sort of stepped back, we had a chance to recalibrate. We had a chance to step back and feel that everything would be new. We got a chance to see things about America that we were not willing to see. There were new rules that were not in place yet and old rules that were crumbling. And there's something hopeful about that, because in my study of these betwixt and between moments, these are moments when new things can emerge. On the other hand, and there is another hand, when new rules dissolve. When new rules aren't there and old rules dissolve, people on this threshold don't just feel the quickening of possibility, they also feel the anxiety of a moment when a dictator can step in, authoritarian regime can step in, a strong man can step in. And I think we're seeing that openness to disinformation. And I think that both of those things have come out of that pandemic moment. And the people who care about democracy really have to be on high alert, because both of these things, the possibility of liminality and the dangers of what Durkheim called anomie, the dangers of not having rules, the old rules aren't there and the new ones are not written, they're both happening at once, and we're experiencing all of this at once. So it's a very complex time, both for people who want exciting new social change and for people who really do feel that democracy is in danger.
And Sherry, you are so good about not only articulating the case, but trying to help people to figure out, okay, what do we do? I get it. I'm elevated, I'm inspired, but now what do I do? And in a recent Harvard Business Review article, you wrote about 4 empathy practices, and you called it like the imperative of radical humility, to help us to think about how in this, I don't call it a new normal, a lot of people do, I call it more the novel normal, because things can change and it's a novel virus. But share with us these empathy practices and what you mean by radical humility.
Right. Well, I think coming out of the last question, a word came to mind that I just want to begin. Before I answer that question, I want to just pin a word. That what that mixture of anomie and liminality calls for is vigilance. That before you begin the 4 empathy practices, if you're worried about balancing anomie and liminality and anxiety and possibility, if you're worried about democracy in that mix, what you most of all need is vigilance. And I didn't want to close out that answer without saying that the first practice that's required before we get into how to use empathy is really a heightened vigilance in everything that we do. It's not a time to kind of be asleep at the wheel. And now let me turn to what I've called these 4 empathy, I've called them rules in kind of tongue-in-cheek way, because I think they rule. I think that I use that kind of in a double meaning thing, because I think that empathy rules in a situation like this. So I couldn't take, I sort of did that tongue in cheek, but they really are practices that I think are helpful. And the first one, and I think this is very hard in a business sense and in educational institutions, is to embrace radical humility, embrace not knowing. To really be able to say, not, oh, I lost my job, I know exactly how you feel, I lost my job too, let's share, let's share. No, people are different. People have had different experiences. To come to the people you lead, to come to your colleagues and be able to say, I'm listening. I don't know your experience. Because being able to say, I don't know, is the hardest thing to do in an email. And it's the hardest thing to do in a conversation. And then the second is to embrace radical difference. Empathy doesn't start with a reassuring, I'm like you. On the contrary, empathy begins with the acceptance of friction. And this is very important. Empathy isn't for papering over the differences in an organization. It isn't to make it look like we have everybody in the group think. It's to acknowledge really where the points of friction are. Empathy is noisy because human beings are. And it's not to kind of tamp down that noise and to come out with a kind of mission statement that makes it seem like we're all on the same page at the end. It's to acknowledge that we're in a community where it's okay that people have different needs and different opinions, and a community can tolerate that. Third, you have to embrace community. Empathy is the goal of empathy is to build relationship, but then relationship in community, that we need each other. Empathy is not altruistic. It isn't, the empathy that you build for yourself is empathy that's going to make you better in your job. The empathy that you build in your job is going to make you a better parent. The thing you do for yourself is going to make us better for all of us. I think finally, embracing commitment. That, when you live in a community, when you accept that empathy is for community, you really can't get bored or turn away. You have to say, I'm in this for the long haul.
You talk about individual empathetic leaders, but you're also giving us some things to think about in terms of what is a workplace where there is empathy or where there are empathetic leaders. What is that like?
Well, the first thing that I've noticed is an empathetic leader can tolerate friction. It doesn't see it, the empathetic leader doesn't see friction or pushback or disagreement as a sign of personal failure, but a sign that he or she is dealing with human beings. An empathetic leader isn't looking for closure. Dynamic communities are working it out in a series of conversations that are ongoing. And an empathic leader knows that because it's confident. And I think that that's the beginning, conversation, not closure. Tolerance for friction and tolerance for disagreement, and not taking it personally as though something's the matter if people are still talking. That's very central to how I see empathic leadership.
How can we use human connections and empathy to do the right thing when it counts in these, what might be friction points, or where it seems as though there's not a good option?
I think this is a key question. I think the first thing is institutions should be able to and empathic leaders need to be able to not hide the fact or the idea that there are no good options. In other words, any thinking, feeling, breathing human in the past 2 years knows that there are simply some questions that we've faced for which there are no good options. American universities went to this model of, we're going back to the normal. We have a new normal. They went back to it. It was a not good option that masqueraded as a must do, that they were following the science. So what did that mean? That meant that I went back to work this fall with these rules that students would wear masks, but they weren't told what kind of mask. So people came in with kind of Halloween costumes, Spider-Man, whatever. And yet this was like, and then we had a testing program that was really to document community spread, not to protect the individual, which I'm not saying was the wrong decision. I'm just saying it wasn't comforting to any individual. It was MIT's private hodgepodge, and everybody else had their own hodgepodge. It would have been much better. It would have been much better to say, and this was like at the best of places, to say, look, this is a bad situation. What is the best we can do in this bad situation?
I heard you talk about, maybe a bit of transparency here as well, but how do you, like, for organizations that really want to stand on societal issues, what's a recommended framework for decision making that you would propose?
I think people do their best when they're asked to be creative in the world of the imperfect. And for organizations to say, instead of having these dictates, for organizations to begin with that empathic, that's what we're in, this world of the imperfect, the conversational, the negotiated. That's what we're made for. Because actually on the ground, when you've had that empathic connection, we've seen healthcare institutions, educational institutions, family, learn how to make 4 ventilators from 1 ventilators. We've seen people learn how to redo shift schedules and learn how to do self-support. Instead of saying, we have to look normal, it has to be, we have to have what was the frame of your question? We have to have a value set that'll work for everybody. What about saying, this is a global pandemic. How can we bring out the best in each person?
In your most recent book, The Empathy Diaries, you say when we don't want to know the truth, we don't hear the truth spoken to us. There seems to be a lack of truth and actually a lack of trust in society today. And that's kind of supported by the Edelman polls that came out that trust is plummeting. Do you think that people are willfully ignoring the truth, and why?
We don't want to blame social media for everything, but let's blame it for a little. I mean, you have an algorithm that says, let's get people fired up by making them angry, and then let's let them only stay and talk to people with whom they agree to keep them angry so they'll stay online. So it's an anti-empathy algorithm. The whole social media business model is an anti-empathy algorithm. Get you mad by feeding you disinformation and crazy stuff, and then only put you in with people who'll keep you mad by reinforcing your belief in whatever crazy stuff you would have heard, and don't expose you to people who might disagree with that. I think we're at a time of crisis because the great philosopher Hannah Arendt talked about that people turn within when they feel that on something about the public, when there's something about the public discourse where there's nothing to be done, events have kind of gone too far. Truth can't be heard. There's no way to exercise your voice in public opinion. And this means that authoritarianism or strongman becomes the only possibility. People go on a kind of flight to the interior.
I'd like to go back to your Empathy Diaries again. And if I can just pull a quote that really is compelling here for our listeners. You said, to fix our crisis of intimacy and privacy, of empathy and human connection, we don't need more apps, we need one another. We are the empathy app, and we have the potential to do the right thing when it counts. It's not too late to reshape the digital to serve the human. How can empathy help us reacclimate to the world where we're now starting to go back into more in-person interactions?
So it's in solitude that mutuality is born. It's in solitude that empathy is born. So that I think that we prepare ourselves for empathy. We prepare ourselves for mutuality. We prepare ourselves for citizenship, for listening, for respect, by enjoying our solitude, by building ourselves up, by respecting who we are as individuals. And that's how we're going to bring ourselves back. But it begins with, I'm not saying that, we're going to get back democracy by psychotherapy, but it has to begin with people feeling self-respect. And that's why questions about inequality of income, dire straits of poverty, child poverty, no medical attention. The things that rob people of their, sense of any self-respect really do enter into, in a very powerful way, these political questions about a democracy losing its possibility because people have to be able to solitude is something, and good feelings about oneself in solitude, you know, they're not easy to find in the most abject conditions.
Oh, it's a wonderful piece of advice for people as we're thinking about going, you know, out of our homes and back into the workplace. Solitude, and I'm reminded of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said, "In the pause, I hear the call." And at the Howe Institute, we know that taking a pause helps us kind of rethink and imagine a better future. And it very much aligns with your advice for each and every one of us. I'd like to know, as we close out our How conversation on moral leadership, particularly about empathy and humility with you, Dr. Sherry Turkle, how do you like to pause? How do you make the most of that time in solitude to begin again, where it's, I'm okay, you're okay?
Well, you know, I grew up at the beach as a child. We were very poor, but by a miracle of New York history, people with not many resources could go to Rockaway Beach, where there were these tear down bungalows. And we spent every summer at the ocean. And I remember at a very low point in my life, my mother had just died. I didn't know what was next. I had to drop out of Harvard. I just went there and spent a few weeks and really just sitting by the ocean. And I remember thinking that I had to move on. I was not the center of things. I sort of reframed my life in which I was not the center of things. I needed to be part of something bigger. I needed allies and friendships and a community. And I just came to this realization that for a better future, a lot of us have to work together. And that's how I pause even now during what I think is a very dark time. But I feel a hopeful time for this country and for the world. Look at that ocean. For a better future, a lot of us have to work together. That ocean wants us to do better for it. So that's how I reframe. I stare at the ocean. I spent COVID at the ocean. That ocean wants us to do better for it.
Well, thank you, Professor Sherry Turkle, for this How conversation on moral leadership, leaving us with new ways to think about moral leadership, particularly empathy, humility, and vigilance for these times. We're so grateful to you and for you.
Well, it was such a pleasure to be here. And I must say that I surprised myself. I really, a couple of times I said vigilance, which is something that really hasn't come up so much in the writing, but I think that's the next thing I'm going to be writing about, vigilance. Thank you so much for having me.